I wake up most mornings before the sun touches the hedges out front, not because I'm eager to meet the day, but because the house has learned my rhythms and creaks in ways that keep a man honest. The baseboard heater pops like a knuckle. The old mantel clock clears its throat across the room, and the floorboards under the hallway runner remember where my wife used to step and press down a little for her even though she's been gone 6 years this April, which is a sentence I say out loud, sometimes as if saying it will make the math tidy. I put the kettle on, rinse the same chipped mug that once rode in the glove compartment of our Buick on long drives to state parks, and measure coffee the way she showed me when we were both young, and still pretending to like the taste of it. A careful scoop and a pause and another scoop, because our hands knew a rhythm that didn't need a scale, and while the water hisses, I tape, close the corner of the crossword where the page curls up and tries to get away. Then I lean my elbows on the quiet kitchen table and tell myself I don't mind the silence, that men of 76 are supposed to have afternoons like this where the mail is nothing but coupons and the phone is nothing but wrong numbers, and the only sound from the street is Hank, who used to deliver the mail on foot when such things were believed to matter, nudging his truck into gear and waving through the glass as if we were both standing in the same year. I tell myself these things because there's a difference between being alone and being made to feel unnecessary, and it's not the quiet that hurts as much as it is the slow, practical retreat of your own family as they learn to organize their days without the nuisance of your opinions, your stories, your way of tapping a jar lid twice before you twist it, and I learned that difference the winter after Linda died when my daughter began to talk to me in a bright, gentle voice reserved for men who leave. Stove burners on and set their glasses down in the refrigerator, which I have never done. Thank you very much, though apparently I am the sort of man who misplaces the television remote in the bread drawer if you ask my son-in-law, and the way he laughed when he told that story at Thanksgiving felt like the first time someone borrowed my name and wore it like a paper party hat. Flimsy, cheerful, meant to be thrown away at the end of the night. I used to keep a list by the phone of little things I needed to remember. Trash day, the water bill, the name of the neighbor's dachshund who liked to bark at the empty fence. And then I stopped because the list became proof. And when the list is proof, the case is already being built against you. So instead, I learned to put my pills in a weekly box the pharmacist gave me, and I made sure the smoke alarm had fresh batteries. And I told myself I would not be the old man whose daughter leaves brochures for life care villas on the counter like coasters, only she did, twice, the second time sliding the glossy paper under the sugar bowl as if it were something she needed to hide from herself, and I read the smiling promises of shuttle buses and chair yoga and chef-designed menus, and set it in the drawer where we used to keep Linda's recipe cards, because I thought the recipes should have company when I couldn't look at them. Say what you want about the way money frees the young to forget old debts, I understand how it works. I spent 38 years reconciling other people's ledgers, and I know a budget's quiet cruelty, but still it surprised me how quickly the requests became normal after my wife's funeral, little things at first that didn't sound like asking. Dad, the twins, winter coats were more than I planned. And it'll be easier to get the mortgage if your name is on the application, too. You know, co-borrower just for the paperwork, not a big change. And how easily my pen found the line, how easily my checkbook learned the names of their needs. I am not a fool, and I am not resentful of money that helps my blood, but there's a particular darkness in being thanked with a distracted kiss on the cheek and the promise that we'll have you over soon, once we're settled, and then discovering 6 months later that settled is a country you are not meant to visit, a place with a garage full of bicycles you never get to watch your grandchildren ride, and a backyard you've only seen in a real estate listing. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I invite you to stand in my living room on a Sunday evening and listen to the phone not ring. This is the shape of an old man's life when grief has emptied a spot at the table and the living rearrange the chairs around the absence so they don't have to feel it. And if I sound bitter, I suppose I am. though bitterness is only salt that collects when the soup boils down and you've been standing at the stove too long. Still, hope is a stubborn weed and keeps finding cracks, and on a Tuesday near the end of March, with a late snow scabbing the edges of the lawns and my hands stiff from a storm that never quite knew what it wanted to be, my daughter called and said, bright as a game show host, that what I needed was a change of scene. And wouldn't it be nice, Dad, to see Europe at last the way you and Mom always talked about? A little guided tour. Nothing strenuous. Lisbon, and maybe a day trip to Sintra. All pastel palaces and pastry, and the way she said pastel made me believe she had done the kind of reading travelers do when they want to sound like they've traveled before, and I felt something warm move through my chest. I hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, not forgiveness, more the untangling of a knot that had been part of my breathing so long I forgot what it was like to take a full breath. I told her I didn't need much, that my suitcase still had Linda's old luggage tag, and my passport was in the desk drawer, wrapped in a Ziploc like all important things in this house, and she laughed and told me not to fuss, that they'd take care of the bookings and the transfers and all the fussy little details I used to relish because they were proof that someone had entrusted me with something, and before I could find the right way to say thank you, she was already describing a hotel with a view of the river, and a breakfast room with those little jars of jam, and how her friend from the office had been last summer and said the sidewalks were uneven so I should bring my cane, not because I needed it, but because it would be nice to have the option. When I hung up, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and looked at Linda's side of the closet because that is what I do when I want guidance, and there was nothing in the quiet except the smell of cedar and the one cardigan she wore on cold church mornings, and I let my hand press against the sleeve until the knit remembered the shape of a wrist. Then I went to the desk and took out the passport and placed it on the bed as if it were a photograph we were both going to enjoy together at last, and found my old plug adapter for European outlets and smiled at my own ridiculousness. The rest of that week turned into lists I pretended not to be making, socks that don't pinch and shoes with a heel that won't argue with cobblestones, a sweater that Linda liked on me because the blue made me look less tired, the electric razor in a zip case so I wouldn't be the American in the hotel sink with whiskers like wire, and I bought a fresh notebook because men of my generation keep lists and call them journals when we want to feel like we are putting something down that might stand up later, and I charged the phone because my daughter likes to text instead of call and because the grandchildren live in a time zone where they are always almost available. In between errands, I practiced saying small words in Portuguese until the syllables softened in my mouth. Obrigado, com licença, desculpe. And I did this not because I expected anyone to clap for me, but because kindness comes easier when you learn the names of things, and I wanted to meet the city as a man who had tried. Derek, my son-in-law, with Ewan, the expensive watch that never catches the light by accident, stopped by the night before we were set to leave, tapping the hood of my car and telling me I should think about selling it if I wasn't driving much these days, that he knew a guy who could get me a good price. And I smiled and said certain decisions were a man's to make when he is ready and not a day before. And he laughed in that way. Men laugh when they want you to think the conversation was never serious, then told me not to worry about handling bags tomorrow. We've got it, Walt. And I let him call me Walt because I didn't want to do battle on the eve of something I had allowed myself to anticipate. There was a text from my daughter after dinner. Don't forget your meds, and pass me your passport at the curb so I can keep everything together. And I felt the faint rub of that sentence but smoothed it down, the way you smooth a wrinkle in a bedspread when company is coming and you want the room to look like care. Has lived there, and I set the passport back on the suitcase and laid the boarding pass printout she had emailed on top of it, marveling at how little paper travel seems to need now. I did not sleep well, not because of dread, I told myself, but because excitement is a kind of noisy neighbor, the one who drags chairs across the floor and can't tell whether the music is loud because the song is good or because the walls are thin. And I walked the rooms twice, touching the stove knobs and the deadbolt and the thermostat, counting my pills into the morning compartment and writing the trash day on a sticky note for Silas next door, who promised to wheel my bin back up the drive. And I sat in Linda's chair for a while, looking at the living room as if seeing it from a doorway in some other country where the afternoon light would be a different color, and I said out loud, as I sometimes do when I want to make a promise stick, that I would be agreeable, that I would not nitpick, that I would take photos of doors and tile and pastries because my daughter likes to show her friends that her father's having a good time, and because somewhere in me there is still the young husband who wanted his wife to see the world and thought he had endless time to do so. Morning came pink and thin and made a liar of the weather report, and I dressed slowly, choosing the navy sweater and the comfortable trousers and the shoes that understand airport floors, and I ate toast I did not taste, and drank half the coffee and poured the rest into the travel mug with the map of the United States on it. And when the SUV swung into the drive with its polite engine and its blinkers like winks, I stood in the doorway with my suitcase and my small list of last-minute reminders tucked into my wallet, and I felt, despite the undertow of worry that keeps residence in men who have loved and lost, something like the old warmth of being included, of being fetched, of being necessary to the shape of a plan. And I told myself that if the edges of things felt a little too smooth, if the kindness came wrapped in a tone that keeps company with condescension, I would ignore it and call it nerves and treat this trip as a chance no one gets twice, because at a certain age what you have left to spend most wisely is not money, it is your willingness to hope. At the airport the air was filled with the tired smell of fast food, perfume that belonged to someone richer than me, and the metallic tang of floor polish, and as I shuffled along with my modest suitcase, trying to keep up with my daughters. Determined stride, I told myself that the nerves were nothing but the normal excitement of travel, that the stiffness in my stomach was a simple echo of age and not a warning, though in truth I had not stepped foot in an international terminal in decades, and the whole scene looked to me less like an invitation to wonder than a gigantic machine waiting to sort, stamp, and swallow people. And still I felt strangely proud to be there, to be part of something again, to be moving with them toward a promised adventure. She glanced at me and smiled, the professional smile she had learned in the office, quick, glossy, and gone before I could answer, then held out her hand for my passport, saying it would be easier if she carried everything together. That way, nothing would get lost, and although a part of me wanted to keep it in my own breast pocket where I had tucked it carefully in its plastic sleeve, I obeyed, because fathers of my generation do not argue with their daughters once they have reached a certain age of authority. So I placed the small blue book into her manicured hand and watched it disappear into her handbag as though she were slipping away a piece of me that I could not get back. The crowd pressed us forward. The announcements blared in voices that seemed indifferent to whether anyone actually understood them, and I told myself not to fret, that soon we would sit at the gate together and laugh about how complicated airports had become. Yet as we approached the passport control line, she slowed, looked over her shoulder at her husband, and whispered something too quiet for me to catch. He nodded, and with a strange gentleness she touched my arm, saying, "Dad, wait here a minute. We'll be right back. Just need to check something with the desk." And before I could ask what, they slipped away into the current of people. Her handbag, swinging lightly, carrying my only proof of identity. I stood near the barrier, clutching the handle of my suitcase, smiling politely at strangers as though to prove I belonged, and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, the flow of passengers thickening, and still no sign of them. At first, I thought perhaps they were at the service desk arguing over a seating upgrade or sorting out the luggage weight. But the longer I waited, the colder the knowledge spread inside me that something was not right. The officer at the podium beckoned impatiently, and when I approached, he asked for my documents. "My daughter has them," I explained, my voice sounding frail to my own ears. "She just stepped away." He frowned, waved me aside, and told me to wait until I had my passport. People stared, and a boy laughed, and I felt my face burn. 20 minutes, then 30. I tried calling her phone, but the number went to voicemail. I tried again and again, each time my hope thinning until it became a thread too fragile to support me. A security guard asked if I was lost, if I needed assistance, and I realized with horror that I looked exactly like the kind of man my daughter had described me to be in recent years. Confused, fragile, an old fool left behind by the tide. I mumbled that I was fine, but my hands shook, and in my pocket the small envelope of emergency cash suddenly felt like a child's toy against the enormity of what had been taken. The announcements continued, boarding calls for flights to places I had dreamed of but would never see, and the truth finally stood before me in its plain and brutal shape. They were not coming back. My own daughter and her husband had walked away with my passport, my credit card, and whatever illusion I still carried that I was part of their family. I stood in that bright, indifferent hall and felt as though the floor had opened beneath me, dropping me into a silence so complete that the noise of the airport could not reach me. I did what people do when they have been left without explanation. In a place designed for flow, I tried to become part of the furniture. I stood near a pillar that wore a map of the concourse like a shawl and pretended to study it so no one would notice the way my hands had begun to shake. And when a woman in a navy blazer with an airport badge asked whether I needed assistance, I smiled in the friendly, harmless way I practiced after Linda died and told her that my daughter had my passport and would be right back, which sounded believable inside my mouth until I heard it travel the short distance to her clipboard and harden there as a note under the heading "Unaccompanied Elder," and she guided me with that careful shepherding touch to a row of molded chairs by a glass wall and asked me for a second number in case we couldn't reach my daughter, and I gave her the only other number I had, my son-in-law's, then watched her step aside to make the calls while I pinched the bridge of my nose to quiet the pulse that had set up a drum in my head, and it felt already like a hearing where my part would be to look tired and manageable while other people summarized me in words that looked neat on forms. She returned with a kind smile that sat on her face like a mask in a shop window, and explained that neither number had answered. Perhaps the signal was poor, perhaps they were at the counter, and she offered me water from a paper cone and a granola. Bear she produced from a tote that said "Customer Care," and I thanked her because manners are not a costume you put on and take off, they are a way of being that tells you you are still yourself. But when she suggested getting a wheelchair just for comfort and asked whether there was any condition we should be aware of, the shame rose in me like heat from a faulty radiator, and I heard my own father's voice in mine as I said too evenly that I could stand and that I did not need to be. Catalogued. A supervisor came, a man with a haircut like a new brush and a badge that carried more weight, and he used the voice people use when they want to sound both official and compassionate, a difficult trick that always lands as suspicion, and he said the words "safeguarding protocols" and "duty of care," and I realized with a cold clarity that somewhere between the check-in kiosks and the sliding doors I had ceased to be a passenger and had become a potential problem. A loose wheel they were, obligated to tighten before it rolled into the headlines, and I remembered that my daughter had once told me, with the kind of patience that is actually impatience in its Sunday clothes, that sometimes older adults simply cannot manage travel anymore. And it is better for everyone to admit it. The supervisor asked whether there was any other ID on me, and I reached for my wallet with relief because I knew exactly where it was, and because showing a document you have kept track of is a small way to take back ground. But when my fingers opened the leather and touched the empty slot where the card should have sat, I felt the room tilt. My driver's license was there, thank God, but the credit card I had slid behind it for safety had vanished, and as my thumb searched the seams, I pictured the curbside moment that morning, The easy choreography of passing things to my daughter because she wanted to keep everything together, and realized that everything had included my card, which made the story I was standing in less a miscommunication and more a plan. I handed the license to the supervisor and watched his eyes move over the photo and the dates, and something in his stance softened, as if having a rectangle of state plastic meant I could be dealt with in the ordinary way. But then he asked again for a way to contact my family, and I made the mistake of calling my daughter in front of him. And when the call went to voicemail for the third time, and I left a message that began in a measured tone and ended with my voice fraying into a plea, I saw him make a discreet note and gesture to the woman in the navy blazer, and it was then that the little glass room appeared, the kind of room every modern building contains where things can be sorted out and people can be contained without admitting that containment is what is happening. Inside the room, the air felt too clean, and a clock hummed with the precise indifference of a courtroom, and through the glass I could see the rolling river of travelers lifting their chins to the departure boards as if to the sun. And I thought that when you are young, the world is a field with fences you can jump, and when you are old, it is a series of lanes. Someone else assigns you, and you are praised for staying in them. They asked again, gently, about medical conditions, about medications, about whether anyone had ever expressed concern for my memory. And I answered honestly, because honesty is my only form of pride. Yes, I took pills for blood pressure and for a heart that had done more hours than its warranty. No one had ever diagnosed me with anything except normal grief. And I heard myself saying Linda's name and stopped, because I did not want her to be present in this room. She had already endured, enough rooms made bright and merciless. The woman tried my daughter once more from a phone with a restricted number, and then my son-in-law. And when at last someone picked up, there was a silence while she introduced herself and explained where I was, and then another silence that went on, long enough to collect meanings, and I watched the woman's face as she listened, and I saw something that looked like pity, followed by resolve. And when she returned, she was careful with the words, explaining that my daughter was nearby, but sorting out a travel complication, and that they had asked the airport to keep me safe until they could come back. And I understood that my daughter had found a way to deputize the system to do what she had not had the courage to do in person, to make me an object of procedure, and the humiliation was so complete I could taste its copper. I asked for my license back, and for permission to step outside the room to call my bank, and the supervisor hesitated in the way of a man weighing a rule against a human face, then nodded and offered to stand nearby, which I accepted because at that point dignity was measured in inches, not yards. I dialed the number I knew from 1,000 customer service calls when I still took pleasure in fixing small things before they became large, and I answered the questions the recorded voice asked. Because this, at least, I could pass. Mother's maiden name, last deposit amount, the street I lived on when Linda and I were newly married and thought we could teach each other patience like a language. When the living person came on the line, she asked if I was calling to confirm the cash withdrawal flagged as unusual, and I steadied my voice and said I was not. And she told me that within the last hour someone had used my card number at an ATM on the opposite side of the terminal, and that there had been an attempt to add a new mobile number to the account profile, but it had failed because it did not match my last two-factor method. And I closed my eyes because there are moments when the worst thing is not surprise, but recognition. The sense that you always knew the person you loved could become this if the world led them to the edge and they decided to keep walking. I asked her to freeze the card, to add a note that no changes could be made by anyone but me, and only in person at my branch, and then I asked an odd question I would not have thought to ask if my daughter had not called me confused so many times. That confusion now sounded like strategy. I asked whether anyone had requested a copy of my statements be mailed to a new address in the last month, and there was a pause and a tapping of keys, and then a careful answer that an online request had been initiated but not completed, and the anger that surged through me was so pure and bright it had edges, not the bitterness of old complaints but the clean pain of a fresh cut. The supervisor coughed politely to remind me of the world outside the call, and I thanked the woman at the bank with a steadiness that surprised me, then ended the call and told the supervisor that I would not be waiting in the room any longer, that I was not a lost item to be held for collection, that I would sit in public where more eyes meant fewer misunderstandings, and he considered this and agreed on the condition that I remain near the information desk where his staff could check on me. And I accepted because battles must be chosen with care, and because I had another call to make, not to my daughter, but to the number of the consulate I had looked up in an idle moment weeks ago when the trip was still a dream, and I had been the sort of man who prepared. The consular receptionist was brisk, but not unkind, asked me for the facts, asked what identification I still possessed, explained the route to a temporary travel letter if I could prove citizenship with my license and an accompanying document, suggested that if I could reach my home bank for a notarized confirmation of identity, the process would be simpler, and for the first time since my daughter disappeared into the crowd, I felt a small alignment inside me, a click like a key turning. Not hope exactly, but agency elbowing back into the room. A man sat down beside me and pretended not to listen as people do when they are listening, then slid a small packet of tissues toward me without meeting my eyes, and I thanked him and used one not because I needed it, but because gratitude is its own duty, and I wanted to pay something to someone who had asked nothing of me. Across the way, a teenage boy lifted his phone to record, or to message, or to turn me into a story for his friends, and I resisted the urge to stand and deliver a speech about fathers and daughters and the slow erasure of usefulness, because speeches are for rooms where someone has consented to be audience, and here I had to husband my breath for other uses. My phone buzzed once with a message from a number I did not recognize, a short sentence with no greeting telling me to please wait with staff and promising that we'll sort everything, and because it arrived minutes after the woman had spoken to my daughter, I knew who had sent it, and if there had been any marrow left for doubt, it was consumed then. Sorting everything meant sealing a story around me that would make me small enough to carry. It meant that when they returned, I would be escorted like a parcel to a destination chosen for me. And I realized with an almost physical jolt that whatever love remained between my daughter and me was now a rope she was using to pull me where she wanted me, and if I let her finish the knot, it would take lawyers and months to cut me free. I rose slowly, not dramatically, the way a man stands after a long wait because standing is what you do when you are supposed to move forward, and I told the woman in the navy blazer that I needed a restroom and then a place to sit near the public. Phones because my cell battery was low, which was true, and she escorted me and reminded me gently that they were there to help. And I nodded because there is no profit in arguing with people who may yet be asked to swear they saw you lucid and steady. And in the tiled privacy I looked at my face and thought how it would appear in the narrative being drafted without me. Tired, confused, uncooperative, and I straightened my shoulders and repeated my address and social security number under my breath like a soldier checking kit, then stepped back into the fluorescent air and began, for the first time in a long while, to make a plan that did not depend on anyone's permission. I had always believed that the worst pain comes in quiet increments, like a faucet drip wearing stone. But the truth is, there are moments when the world pulls off its mask all at once and you are forced to see yourself through the eyes of those who wish you diminished, and that recognition cuts deeper than any slow erosion. It was in that terminal, after hours of pretending I was just a delayed traveler waiting for his family to return, that the realization struck with the finality of a gavel. My daughter had not simply misplaced me in the shuffle of travel. She had orchestrated a removal, a subtraction of my presence from her life, and she had chosen the indifferent machinery of an airport to disguise it as accident. When the bank confirmed the attempted withdrawals and the supervisor's careful notes hinted at cognitive concerns, I understood with a clarity that left me dizzy that the plan was not only abandonment, but erasure, the groundwork for declaring me incompetent, a story already seeded with little lies about confusion and forgetfulness, a story that would grow without my consent until my signature was worth nothing and my assets no longer mine to decide. I thought of the conversations I had tolerated in recent years, the way she would say, "You don't remember, Dad," when in fact I remembered too well, the way her husband would joke about my supposed clumsiness as if rehearsing lines for a case yet to be filed, and it all fell into place with the elegance of cruelty. They had been preparing a narrative in which my every protest could be dismissed as proof of decline. My body reacted before my mind could temper it. I felt heat rise to my face, my chest tightened, my pulse banged against my temples, and I thought absurdly that this was how men my age were felled, not by accidents or illnesses, but by betrayal, delivered at just the right angle. I staggered from the little glass room into the corridor of travelers moving toward their gates, and for a moment envied them their ordinary journeys, their arguments over boarding groups, their children tugging at sleeves, their petty irritations that had not yet curdled into existential exile. I wanted to shout at them, to announce that a father had been discarded within sight of their luggage carts, but I knew the spectacle would only lend weight to the false picture painted of me. So I forced myself into stillness, gripping the handle of my suitcase like a tether to sanity. When the consulate clerk on the phone told me that, with the right documentation, I could reassert my identity, I felt not relief, but the first stirrings of defiance, the knowledge that survival in this moment would not be a matter of waiting for rescue, but of crafting my own. Yet, even as I plotted the logistics of temporary papers and bank freezes, the deeper wound bled. The recognition that my own child had chosen to stand on the opposite side of the courtroom that life becomes in old age, that she had cast me not as father or even nuisance, but as obstacle, and that in her calculus the inheritance of my absence outweighed the inconvenience of my presence. It is one thing to suspect neglect, another to taste the deliberate flavor of betrayal, and in that instant the world I had been walking through, one where reconciliation was still possible, where trips together might soften old rifts, collapsed, replaced by a harsher geometry where every kindness I accepted from her hands was reinterpreted as a maneuver toward this very moment. I sat there under the sterile light of a departure board listing cities I would not see, and felt the weight of a choice pressing on me. Accept the role they had scripted, the doddering liability to be shepherded into managed care, or seize what remained of my agency and fight, even if the fight meant standing alone. And in that recognition, harsh and unsentimental, I reached the true middle of my story, the point where the stakes were no longer measured in comfort or companionship, but in the preservation of dignity itself. I left the bright little glass room with its laminated posters about courtesy and compliance and took a seat where the concourse widened into a kind of indoor plaza, a place designed to make waiting feel like participation. And, while travelers funneled past with their lattes and rolling bags, I opened the Notes app on my phone and began doing the unromantic work of protecting a life. Not because I believed paperwork could cure heartbreak, but because I understood now that heartbreak was the instrument my daughter had chosen to pry open the locks around my name. I wrote down the time of the first unanswered call to her, the time the bank confirmed the ATM withdrawal, the name of the supervisor who had suggested a wellness room, and then I dialed the bank's fraud department again and asked them to add a verbal password that only I would know, a ridiculous little phrase from a road trip Linda and I had taken the summer of '79 when we ate peaches over a sink in Tennessee, and laughed because the juice ran to our elbows. And when the representative on the other end repeated the password back to me and promised that nothing could be changed without it, I exhaled for the first time since the two of them disappeared into the crowd and realized how much of living at my age is the defense of ordinary boundaries against those who insist they know better. The woman in the navy blazer checked on me, and I could see she was relieved to find me busy rather than agitated. So I asked whether there was a notary anywhere in the terminal, and she brightened as if I had asked for a sandwich. Yes, there was a shipping store just past security with a notary on duty until 5, and would I like someone to walk me there? And I said I would prefer to stay on the public side, and asked instead for a printer, which she arranged at the information desk with the same care a nurse uses to turn down a bed. And I printed a short letter that said, in the dry language of institutions, that I remained of sound mind, and requested my bank and brokerage freeze all outgoing wires pending my in-person appearance tomorrow, and I signed and dated it and had the information clerk stamp the time, a stamp that meant nothing legally but everything to me, because it was a mark in the world that said here I had asserted myself. It was at that counter, leaning on the scuffed plastic where 1,000 boarding passes had rested, that my phone rang with a number that pulsed familiarity and dread. And when I answered, my daughter's voice arrived airy and bright as a commercial, telling me not to worry, telling me everything was a misunderstanding, telling me they had my passport safe and were resolving a hiccup. And when I asked her to meet me immediately in the public concourse, not at a gate or a counter or any back office, there was a hesitation that sounded like the click of a metronome between one plan and another. Then she said of course and hung up before I could say that I would be waiting where the skylight made the terrazzo look like water. They came 10 minutes later with expressions chosen for a particular audience. My daughter, with concern carefully arranged about her eyes, my son-in-law with a brisk competence he reserves for inspectors and clerks, and before they reached me, he peeled off toward a security officer in a yellow vest and began talking with his hands in the way that suggests both urgency and command. And I understood with the sharpness of a pinprick that they had not come to return anything but to complete a story in which I was unreliable and the airport merciful. My daughter sat, placed her handbag between us as a small wall, and began to explain how the gate agent had warned them of schedule changes, how she had gone to rebook, how Thornton had been trying to call me and must have the wrong number. She stopped because I did not nod, and because something in my face must have broadcast that the ground had shifted, and I told her quietly that the bank had already frozen the card and that the ATM camera would show whoever withdrew the cash, and I watched irritation pass over her features like a cloud and then vanish as she reached for another mask, the one marked hurt, and she said she couldn't believe I would accuse her of stealing from her own father, that all she had ever done was manage details I could no longer manage, and she lifted her hand as if to touch mine, and I pulled back not out of cruelty but to prevent her from setting the scene for those watching, because I could feel the officer in the yellow vest behind me and understood that any gesture could be used to argue for custody, a word I had never associated with myself until that minute. My son-in-law arrived with the officer and a woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as Airport Social Services, and he did not sit but stood behind them like a foreman, explaining that I had been wandering, that I had become confused, that stress made me combative, and how grateful he was that the airport had a place to keep me safe until this upset passed. And the woman with the clipboard asked me for my name and date of birth and my address, and then, softly, whether anyone had ever expressed concern to me about memory changes. And I considered for a moment the particular cruelty of that question, how it demands a man either indict himself or call his child a liar. And I answered in the steady tone I used in years when numbers were my trade, that no doctor had expressed such concern, and that as a matter of record my last evaluation had been ordinary for a man of my age. And then I turned to my daughter and asked her to return my passport in front of the officer, and she said of course. She had merely been keeping it safe, and she opened her handbag and produced not my passport, but a photocopy of the information page, a useless sheet that fluttered in the conditioned air, and I felt a burn rise under my choler that was not rage so much as the memory of every time I had chosen peace over accuracy in an argument with her mother, and I told the officer that my daughter was in possession of my lawful identification, and that I did not consent to being moved or held, and that if anyone intended otherwise I would be grateful if they summoned the police so I could make a report of theft. And in the silence that followed I saw Thornton's eyes harden because he knew he had miscalculated the stage and the audience. The woman with the clipboard asked if we might step aside to talk privately, and I said no, that I would conduct whatever conversation needed conducting here in the open. And I took out my pocket notebook, an old habit my daughter mocks, and read aloud the times of my calls and the details from the bank, and I could feel the small crowd that gathers around any scene in an airport tilt a degree in my favor, because people know the sound of a man keeping his place in a world determined to shove him out of it. And I pressed that inch of advantage by asking the social worker if she could note in her file that I had asked twice for my passport to be returned, and that my request had been refused. And she nodded almost imperceptibly while her pen hovered, a bird uncertain where to land. My phone vibrated again with a message from my neighbor Silas, the one who takes my bin to the curb when my knees argue with me, and he wrote that a white SUV had been in my driveway an hour ago, and a man who looked like a locksmith had gone inside with my daughter and left with a small metal box, and there it was, the second blow of the day, the theft expanding from paper and plastic to the anchored things of a life, and my chest went cold, not because of the box. I keep my will and the deeds at the lawyer's office, but because I understood that she was staging the next act at my house while playing out this one at the airport, and I showed the text to the officer and to the social worker and said I was going to call the police to report illegal entry, and my son-in-law barked a laugh that sounded like a cough and said it was a misunderstanding, that they had been checking the smoke detectors, and I turned to the officer and asked whether the airport would prefer this conversation in front of gate at 12 or with a uniform present. And to his credit he chose the latter and radioed for an officer, and I thought how often dignity is preserved by the simple insistence on procedure. While we waited, my daughter tried one more time to fold me back into the script, lowering her voice to that intimate pitch used at hospital beds, telling me that if I would just come with them now, everything could be sorted out. A quiet room, and a late lunch, and a chance to rest. And I told her that my rest would come in my own chair, and that the only quiet room I needed was the office of my attorney. And when the police arrived, I handed them my license and my notebook and asked that a report be made, including the observation that my daughter acknowledged possession of my passport but refused to surrender it. And the officer listened without the condescension I had braced for and asked my daughter directly if she had my passport, and she said she did not, that she had placed it in the carry-on and in the excitement it must have been set down somewhere, and the officer wrote that sentence in his book and then asked me if I felt safe to leave, and I said I did now that the bank was frozen and the report filed, and he offered to walk me to the taxi stand, and I accepted because at a certain point the show of protection is itself a protection, a signal to would-be rescuers that the damsel is not in distress. Outside, the air smelled of rubber and jet fuel and the sweet rot of the ornamental cherry trees, and I climbed into the back of a cab with the careful determination of an athlete finishing a meet he did not train for, and I told the driver my address and asked him to wait when we arrived, and as the city slipped by in a sequence of reflectively tinted windows and corner florists, I felt the fatigue descend. An iron cloak I could not shake, but under it something else had begun. Not anger, not even resolve, but a kind of clean quiet in which decisions look like landmarks instead of guesses. At home, the front door hung closed and unmarked. There were no signs of forced entry, and when I stepped inside, the air had the thin, altered smell that follows a stranger's hands. Not a mess, nothing obvious, just the displacement that occurs when objects have been handled with a purpose other than affection, and on the hall table a slip from a locksmith lay like a calling card with my daughter's signature scrawled on the customer line and a note, "Deadbolt serviced," which was a lie that would do for a truth until a judge read it. I sat at the kitchen table, the same square of wood where I had taught my daughter to tally the cost of her first bicycle with taxes, and where I had signed the check for her first apartment, and I took out Linda's old address book, the one with telephone numbers written in pencil to allow for the moving of lives, and I called Martin, the lawyer who had filed our wills and the deed to our house all those years ago, and I told him everything, without decoration, and he did what good lawyers do for old men who have been stripped of adornments. He told me what to do next and what to expect when the people you love decide to make you a problem. He advised me to revoke any old powers of attorney, even the precautionary ones we had signed. After Linda's stroke, and to do it in writing and to file it with the clerk and to notify the bank in person, he told me to place a fraud alert with the credit bureaus and to request a freeze. He told me to bring him tomorrow any letters my daughter had ever had me sign so he could examine the signatures for misuse, and he told me, with none of the impatience younger men reserve for complication, that if my daughter had filed anything ex parte with the court, temporary guardianship, emergency, conservatorship, we would fight it not only with doctor's letters but with the logic of how I had navigated this day and the notes I had taken, and the phrases landed like dry stones in a wall, each one a defense I could lean on when the next gust came. After we hung up, I did a small, mean thing that felt like oxygen. I stood, walked to the hutch, and removed the photograph my daughter loves most, the one of her at 9 holding the blue ribbon from the county fair, because I would not have that smugness used in any future story about a doting child doing her poor father a kindness, and I wrapped it in brown paper and placed it in a box I labeled with the date, and then I sat down again and called my insurer and named myself as my own only contact. No trusted person, no family notification, and the woman on the phone hesitated and then said of course, and I heard in her pause all the stories she had handled that ended differently. Night came quickly as it does after a day spent beneath fluorescent lights, and I made eggs, the simplest food, and ate them standing because sitting still had become a danger, and as I washed the pan I felt my phone rumble with a new message from an unknown number that announced itself as my grandson, a boy who had not called me in years, telling me that Mom said I was in a clinic and that he hoped I felt better, and could he send anything, and the lie struck me in a tender place I had hoped was scar tissue, and I wrote back with more gentleness than he deserved that I was at home and well and that I loved him and that I hoped his exams were going to plan, and then I took a photograph of the eggshells in the sink and sent it with the message, "Evidence of freedom," and he did not reply, which was an answer of its own, and I understood then the full perimeter of what my daughter had constructed, not only a legal narrative but a social one, a rumor that would make any future protest of mine sound like a prisoner's denial. I slept poorly and woke with a clarity that did not feel like courage so much as gravity. By mid-morning, I was at the bank in a jacket and tie because old men in ties are allowed more authority than old men in cardigans, and I signed the forms that made me briefly powerful again, and we called the number on the locksmith's slip together from the banker's desk and asked for the work order and the recorded call and the signature copy, and the clerk promised to email them, and I went from there to the county clerk with Martin, who had already drafted the revocation of the ancient power of attorney and the declaration of capacity from my physician, and we filed them and obtained stamped copies warm from the machine. And then, because escalation demands its own proof, Martin pulled a thin folder from his briefcase and showed me the thing he had discovered that morning, that 4 days earlier an online petition had been opened in my daughter's name, seeking temporary guardianship on the grounds of progressive cognitive decline demonstrated during travel, and he pointed to the section labeled Supporting Documentation. And there, clipped and scanned, were the fictions that had been tested on me at dinner over the past year, the supposed incident with the spaghetti, the forgetting the stove, the whiskey with blood pressure meds, each one elevated from petty humiliation to affidavit, and the rage that moved through me then was not noisy. It was a winter tide retreating and revealing rocks I could use for footing, and I told Martin in a voice I recognized from a younger man that they would not have me, not my name, not my house, not the quiet I had made for myself after Linda, and he nodded and said that now we would move first, that we would schedule the hearing and we would bring the bank timestamps and the police report and the airport social worker's note, and we would give the judge a picture not of a sainted father but of a competent man who refused the asylum others built for their convenience. And I realized that vengeance, if it was to be mine at all, would not be served in a flourish but in a file folder, pages and signatures and dates that said, against the drift of rumor, that I had stood upright and insisted on being counted. The day of reckoning came not in some grand courtroom with robes and gavels, but in an ordinary office with fluorescent lights buzzing above us. Yet as I sat there waiting to sign the final papers that would strip my daughter and her husband of the control they believed they had secured forever, I felt a stillness inside me unlike anything I had known in years, a kind of terrible calm that only comes when the years of humiliation and suspicion collapse into one irreversible choice. Veronica, my lawyer, had already confirmed that the judge had upheld my rights, that the accusations of incompetence had been dismissed as the fabrications they were, that my medical reports were clean and my testimony consistent. And when the clerk handed me the pen, I signed with the same hand that had once written tuition checks, mortgage contributions, and gifts disguised as love, and I thought how strange it was that the same signature could once represent generosity and now represent final judgment. As I pressed the pen down, the door burst open, and there they were, my daughter pale and frantic, my son-in-law tight-lipped and venomous, and for a moment the room froze, every head turning as if a storm had forced its way inside. She shouted that it was illegal, that I had been manipulated, that the papers meant nothing, but the clerk calmly informed her that the matter was settled, and that her protests were late. And the look she gave me then was not only rage but disbelief, as if she could not reconcile the quiet, obedient man she had known with the one sitting before her, holding a completed deed of sale. Thornton hissed that I had destroyed their lives, that I had left them homeless, that no decent father would do this to his only child, and I answered with a steadiness that surprised even me, that no decent child would abandon her father in a foreign city with no papers and no money, that no decent man would whisper poison into her ear until she believed cruelty was practicality. The room had grown silent except for our voices, and I realized that this was my courtroom after all, an audience of clerks and assistants witnessing not just a transaction but a verdict years in the making. My daughter's voice cracked then, breaking from fury into desperation, and she pleaded in tones that once would have undone me, begging me not to cut her off, not to make her children strangers to me, and for a second my chest tightened at the memory of Hazel and Reginald's small hands in mine. But then I remembered the message where my grandson had been told I was already locked away in a clinic, the lie my daughter herself had planted, and the tenderness curdled back into resolve. I stood, gathered my papers, and told her plainly that the inheritance she had tried to steal was already gone, that I had rewritten my will, and that if my grandchildren wished one day to know the truth, they would find it in the letter I had left for them, sealed and waiting with the attorney, but that as for her and Thornton, they would find nothing but silence from me from this day forward. She lunged then, perhaps to embrace me, perhaps to claw back some shred of control, but Thornton held her back with a grip that was more ownership than comfort, and in her eyes I saw the collapse of years of calculation, the dawning knowledge that all the schemes, the humiliations, the carefully seeded rumors had only led to this moment where she stood stripped of both house and influence, and I walked past them slowly, each step a declaration that I was no longer theirs to diminish. Outside the building, the air was sharp with the smell of rain on concrete, and I realized my hands were trembling not from fear, but from the release of years of stored tension. And as I lifted my face to the gray sky, I thought of Lavinia and whispered that it was done, that I had finally chosen dignity over illusion, and for the first time in decades I felt not abandoned, but free. The weeks after the papers were signed did not feel like victory so much as the slow return of ordinary gravity, a settling of objects into the places where they had always wanted to rest. And, in that quiet, I rebuilt a life that did not ask permission from anyone. Mornings began again with coffee measured the way Linda taught me when we pretended measuring mattered. The window by the sink opened to the lake where the geese kept their untidy schedule, and I learned the names of the grounds crew who trimmed the hedges and waved as if my wave counted, which in its small way was a kind of restoration, because being counted is all an old man asks for in the final chapters of his book. The bank accounts sat under the new locks Martin arranged. The credit freeze held like a pane of reinforced glass between me and other people's plans, and the proceeds from the house I was never invited into were folded into a trust that would not reward haste or cruelty. I named the trust after Linda, gave it simple rules even lawyers would call stubborn, and wrote that 2 scholarships each year would go to late-in-life nurses and hospice aides, because the hands that steadied my wife's last days deserved to touch the future. And as for family, I did not turn into salt. I did not lavish curses over the dry ground. I left a narrow gate that could be opened with effort and honesty, but not with tears on command. For Hazel and Reginald, I wrote separate letters in my sitting chair, while the afternoon light grew the color of lemons, not indictments and not appeals, just a plain account of events and the unadorned wish that they might choose one day to sit with an old man and ask him questions about their grandmother's laugh and the time their mother was small and climbed onto a chair to stir batter as if she were conducting an orchestra. With each letter, I enclosed a copy of the police report and a notarized timeline, not to shame anyone but to keep memory from becoming a rumor, and I sent them by certified mail to their dorm addresses so the truth would not have to ask my daughter's purse for safe transport, and then I set the matter down, like a weight I had carried far enough. My daughter tried once more to arrive as an emergency, a message with a tone I recognized from childhood fevers and missed curfews, asking for a meeting to find a way back. And I answered not with winter, but with conditions, that we would speak in writing for 6 months, that any apology would name the deed and not the feeling, that any request for money would go unanswered because mercy without memory breeds fresh harm, and I told her that if she needed help of the kind courts provide, she should speak to her own lawyer, as I would to mine. And then I turned off the phone and went out to meet Silas by the bocce court where he cheats exactly as much as friendship allows, and we played until the shadows stretched thin, and nobody won, and both of us felt somehow strengthened by the irrelevance of the score. I replaced my passport with a new book, stiff as a hymn, and when it arrived, I sat a long time with its blue cover resting under my palm. Not because I planned to travel far, not because Lisbon still called to me, but because a passport is proof that a country recognizes your name, and after being told in so many small ways that my name was negotiable, it mattered to hold something that testified otherwise. I put the passport in the drawer with Linda's recipe cards and the tiny church bulletin from her memorial, and I closed the drawer gently because some altars a man tends even after he has stopped going to church. On a Saturday when the wind came off the lake with the clean smell of new rain, I walked to the park and met the woman from the airport by arrangement. We had exchanged numbers after she slipped me a tissue at my lowest hour and said she hoped to meet, again under less fluorescent lighting, and we sat on a bench that faces the water and traded stories with the generous economy of people who understand time. And when I told her how it ended, she did not clap or scold or moralize. She just nodded and said that sometimes the first love you must show your children is to stop being the place where their worst selves are comfortable. and the sentence sounded harsh until I put it next to what had happened and found that it fit. In the evenings, I cook without rushing, not to feed grief, but to keep company with the kitchen where our life once lived, and I say grace even if no one is listening, because gratitude is a habit that keeps you from becoming the kind of man who polishes his wounds for visitors, and when I eat, I put a second fork on the table out of muscle memory and leave it there, not as a ghost seat, but as an act of respect for the emptiness that taught me what I am still capable of carrying. Once a week, I volunteer at the little thrift store attached to the clinic where Linda breathed her last clear day, learning the prices of old coats and the stories of the people who put them on and walk out straighter, and when the cash drawer comes. Up balanced, I feel the old accountant's satisfaction, a proof that order can be rebuilt after the ledger has been kicked across the floor. There are nights, of course, when the old anger knocks as if it had a right to the couch. Nights when I see my daughter's face at the office door, young and furious and certain the rules do not apply to her, and for a paragraph or two I rehearse speeches that would peel the paint from her certainty. But then I remember the letter already waiting in Veronica's files, sealed for my grandchildren, and the scholarships that will carry my wife's name into rooms where final kindness is performed, and the knowledge that silence can be not withdrawal, but design. And I set the anger back outside without slamming the door. I do not know if Hazel or Reginald will come. I do not know if my daughter will choose the hard work of truth or the easier comfort of stories she tells herself. I do not know how many more springs will dress the lake in light. But I know that when I hear the small knock of the kettle and the click of the porch bulb and the unimportant hum of evening traffic, I am living under my own roof in the country of my own name, and that if the memory of an airport returns to me with its cold, bright benches and its clipboard questions, I can answer it simply. They told me it was just a vacation, and they walked away with my passport, but I kept walking until I found something larger to travel with, a document no one can pocket, the stubborn visa of a man who chose dignity. And in that choice I finally came home.